Welcome to the channel, Legendary Cars. Some cars got crowned rare not because they were special, but because people wanted them to be. Myths spread, memories blurred, and suddenly every old bucket of bolts became a limited edition. These 8 cars fooled an entire generation. And here's the cold truth.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 8. 1973 Chevrolet Caprice. The 1973 Chevrolet Caprice is one of the funniest examples of how a nostalgia can twist the truth. Today, when one of these giant sedans rolls into a car show, people crowd around it like it's some kind of exotic relic from a forgotten civilization. They throw around words like rare, hard to find, and collector grade, as if the 73 Caprice were built in tiny batches for a chosen few. But that's not what happened at all. In reality, the 1973 Caprice was the absolute monarch of suburban America. If you lived in a neighborhood in the 1970s, you didn't have to go far to see one. You just had to look at your own driveway, or your neighbor's driveway, or the next house down, or the next entire street. These things were everywhere. Chevy built them in massive numbers because families loved them. Dealers wanted them, and GM was more than happy to flood the nation with full-size sedans that rode like couches on wheels. People today mix up rare with survivors are scarce. Those are two very different things. The reason you don't see 1973 Caprices today is not because they were limited production. It's because they lived hard lives, got beaten into the ground, rusted into oblivion, and eventually got junked when the 1980s and 1990s treated big sedans like dinosaurs. These cars didn't retire gracefully. They simply disappeared through attrition. But in 1973, they were the undisputed kings of the road. To understand why people mistakenly believe the 73 Caprice was rare, you have to understand what it represented at the time. This was the first year of GM's massive new Colonnade era, when regulations and crash standards pushed automakers to redesign and bulk up their full-size cars. The Caprice suddenly looked even bigger and more imposing with its squared-off fenders, strong shoulder line, and chunky bumper system. It had presence, the kind of presence modern drivers simply don't expect anymore. But people forget that big cars weren't niche in 1973. They were the default. The oil crisis hadn't hit yet. Gas was cheap. America's highways were expanding. Families wanted space, comfort, prestige, and the feeling of floating over the pavement rather than driving on it. The Caprice delivered all of that in a single enormous package. Chevy's marketing wasn't shy about selling the Caprice as the top of the full-size line, and buyers responded by scooping them up left and right. Dealerships sold these by the truckload, not to collectors, but to everyday suburban parents who wanted a comfortable ride and didn't care about performance or uniqueness. Inside the 1973 Caprice wasn't hand-built luxury, it was mass-produced, assembly-line comfort. A big bench seat, thick carpet, fake wood, a giant steering wheel, enough soft padding to furnish a small living room. This wasn't an exclusive machine. It was the family car of the middle class, engineered to be affordable, easy to maintain, and available everywhere. Mechanically, it was even more ordinary. Most came with small block V8s that were tuned to survive, not impress. They weren't performance monsters, they were reliability tanks, designed to run for years with minimal fuss. The drivetrain was classic GM, rugged, smooth, and meant to last long after the body panels dissolved. And that's exactly what happened. The engines outlived the sheet metal. So why do people insist it's rare? Simple. Nobody saved them. Collectors ignored them for decades because they weren't muscle cars and they weren't premium luxury cars. They were just big, heavy sedans that took up too much space and guzzled too much gas. When the downsized 1977 models arrived, smaller, lighter, more modern, the 1973s became outdated overnight. Many got used up, resold, abused, or retired to the scrapyard with zero fanfare. Now that big sedans have vanished from everyday life, the survivors feel special. But feel special today does not equal rare back then. What you're looking at when you see a surviving 1973 Caprice is not a limited edition model. It's an accidental survivor from the era when America still believed bigger meant better. It represents the height of suburban automotive culture, but it does not represent rarity. It's only uncommon now because most were destroyed by time, rust, neglect, and the shovel-like driving habits of their owners. In 1973, the Caprice was as common as minivans in the 1990s or SUVs in the 2020s. It dominated driveways, parking lot, and school drop-off lines. It was the full-size Chevy, the safe, reliable, comfortable choice, and GM sold them in huge quantities without hesitation. So whenever someone tells you the 73 Caprice is rare, just remember, it was everywhere. It ruled the suburbs. It wasn't rare. It was the standard.
Number 7. 1971 Dodge Polara. The 1971 Dodge Polara has somehow slipped into that strange category of cars that owners love to exaggerate. Bring one to a car meet and you'll almost always hear the same proud declaration, "Oh yeah, this is a rare one, police spec, not many of these around." And sure, today you don't see many on the roads, but that has nothing to do with rarity. It has everything to do with time, rust, and the fact that the Polara was built in droves for the most ordinary people imaginable. The myth of rarity has grown only because the survivors are few, not because Dodge made only a handful. Back in 1971, the Polaris sat right in the middle of Dodge's full-size lineup, and Dodge wanted it in every driveway, parking lot, taxi fleet, and government garage. The car was designed to be a bulk seller, something big, comfortable, and straightforward for families who wanted a sedan that could swallow miles of highway without complaint. And that's exactly what it became, a car that blended into American suburbia so thoroughly that it now feels invisible in hindsight. The idea that every Polara was a police interceptor is one of the most enduring myths. Yes, Dodge did offer police packages, and yes, those versions had beefier suspensions, bigger brakes, and engines tuned for pursuit duty. But what people forget is that those police units represented a tiny fraction of overall production. The overwhelming majority of Polaras sold in 1971 were plain four-door sedans powered by the reliable but modest 318 or 360. These were not hot rod specials. These were appliance cars, the kind you bought because you needed space and comfort, not bragging rights. Fleet sales were a huge part of the Polaris story. Municipal governments, utility companies, taxi operators, and federal agencies bought them by the hundreds. Dodge practically marketed the Polara as the perfect fleet car. And they were right. The car was easy to maintain, roomy enough for passengers or gear, and cheap compared to import alternatives. When you bought a 1971 Polara, you weren't getting a rare gem. You were getting the same car your local power company had. It was mass transportation disguised as personal transportation. Another sneaky contributor to the Polara's faux rarity status today is its sheer size. In an era when modern cars are compact, efficient, and aerodynamically shaped, the Polara looks like a relic from a parallel universe, an enormous slab-sided giant with a hood large enough to host a picnic. The fact that these cars have disappeared from roads simply makes people assume they must have been rare to begin with. But the truth is simpler. Few cars of this era survived. Rust took many. Hard use took more. Police units in particular were driven hard, crashed often, and junked without remorse. And let's be honest, in its day, the Polara was not considered collectible. It was not a muscle car, it was not cutting edge, and it was not flashy. It was respectable but dull, dependable but unremarkable. When a car lacks glamour, people don't save them. They drive them, wear them out, and send them off to the crusher when repairs cost more than the car is worth. That's exactly what happened to the Polara. Today, when an owner insists their 1971 Polara is some kind of rare treasure, they're not lying. They're just misunderstanding the difference between rarity and survival rate. The Polara survived in small numbers, so the ones that remain look impressive. But that doesn't change the fact that Dodge sold mountains of them. If production numbers dictated collector interest, the Polara would still be at the bottom of the list. What remains interesting about the Polara is not scarcity, but its representationalness. It is a perfect snapshot of early 1970s American automotive thinking. Big, comfortable, honest, and built with the idea that gasoline would always be cheap and space would always be abundant. It's a time capsule of the era before fuel crises, emission controls, and downsizing reshaped what a full-size sedan could be. So, the next time someone points at a 1971 Polara and claims they only made a few of these, you'll know the truth. It wasn't rare, wasn't exotic, and wasn't exclusive. It was simply a workhorse, a widely sold and widely used piece of everyday America. Its myth of rarity is just that, a myth built from the fog of nostalgia and the disappearance of cars that nobody bothered to save. And honestly, that reality makes the Polara even more interesting than if it were some limited production hero. It was a democratized machine, a car that served millions without fanfare, and today stands not as a rare collectible, but as a forgotten witness to the era when big sedans ruled the streets.
Number 6. 1958 Ford Custom 300. The 1958 Ford Custom 300 is one of those cars that has been swept into the modern myth-making machine of classic car culture. Someone sees the fins, the chrome, the two-tone paint, and suddenly the legend begins. Wow, that must be rare. A real 50s classic. Owners often lean into that assumption, proudly telling people that their Custom 300 is a hard-to-find Ford from the golden era. But when you peel back the nostalgia, the truth is much more practical, almost brutally so. The Custom 300 of 1958 was not rare, not exclusive, and definitely not high-end. It was Ford's basic, bare-bones, budget breadwinner, built to appeal to the everyday working American. To understand how common the Custom 300 truly was, you have to look at Ford's strategy in the late 1950s. The company offered a wide ladder of models, Fairlane, Fairlane 500, and various performance and luxury trims. The Custom 300 sat below all of those. It was the car you bought when you needed a Ford, but you didn't want to spend any more money than absolutely necessary. In other words, it was the car for the man who looked at the dealership, shrugged, and said, "Just give me the cheapest full size you've got." And Ford was more than happy to accommodate him. The Custom 300 was intentionally stripped down. It had minimal chrome compared to the flashier Fairlane. The interiors were plain, the fabrics simple, and the trim limited. It offered practicality over glamour, reliability over flash, and affordability over prestige. Ford knew exactly what segment the Custom 300 belonged to: families who wanted dependable transportation, fleet buyers who needed durability, and small-town customers who valued function over image. The 1958 model year itself often tricks people into believing that any surviving Ford from that year must be a rare collectible. The late 50s are iconic in car culture. Tail fins, Jet H styling, big bodies, dramatic flair, but the Custom 300 is the exception to that romantic narrative. Yes, it has fins and chrome, but the design remains restrained compared to its pricier siblings. And because it was the entry-level model, Ford sold a lot of them. Production was high because demand was high. This was the car you saw at gas stations, parked in driveways, pulling families to Sunday picnics, and delivering newspapers in the early morning hours. What contributes to the myth of rarity today is simple. These cars didn't survive. Budget cars rarely do. They were bought by people who didn't treat them as future collectibles. They treated them as tools, as family haulers, as workhorses. They racked up high mileage. They spent winters rusting in driveways. They were patched together, driven harder than their upscale cousins, and eventually scrapped without a second thought. It's not that Ford didn't build many, it's that few people had a reason to keep them. When a cheap car hits the end of its useful life, out it goes. Another point of confusion is how the Custom 300 looks to modern eyes. If you bring one to a show, most people won't know the difference between a Fairlane 500, and the Custom 300 unless they're dedicated Ford historians. The average onlooker sees fins, chrome, and the 1958 badge and assumes rarity. It's the aesthetic illusion. Anything with flamboyant 50s styling automatically feels collectible, regardless of its original market position. But underneath, the Custom 300 is still the budget Ford it always was. Mechanically, it was offered with modest engines, straight sixes, and small V8s because budget buyers needed reliability and good economy more than performance. The powerful Interceptor V8s associated with the more premium Fords weren't what you found in your average Custom 300. Most were basic sedans or two-doors with nothing more than manual steering, drum brakes, and bare-bones interiors. They were built to be economical, not legendary. In today's collector market, the Custom 300 still sits in an odd place. Some owners cling to the idea that their cars are rare treasure because it's from 1958, but serious Ford enthusiasts know the truth. Rarity comes from low production numbers or special features, and the Custom 300 had neither. What it does offer is a fascinating snapshot of ordinary America in the late 50s. It's a reminder of a time when families just needed a full-size car that started every morning and could haul kids, groceries, and luggage without complaint. The irony is that the Custom 300 may be more interesting today because it was ordinary. It represents the reality behind the glamour, showing what most people actually drove, while the flashy, more expensive models hog the spotlight. Instead of being rare, it's a survivor of a class of cars that wasn't meant to be preserved. It's a piece of history that slipped through the cracks of collectability and came out the other side with a story far more honest than those rare collectible myths. So no, the 1958 Ford Custom 300 isn't rare. What it is, however, is a genuine artifact of everyday America, a reminder that not every classic car started life as a star. Some simply earned their place by being useful, affordable, and everywhere.
Number 5. 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88. The 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88 is one of those cars that has been unintentionally wrapped in a fog of modern-day misunderstanding. Tell someone you own a 67 Olds full-size, and 9 times out of 10 they'll ask, is it a Delta 88? And when you correct them, no, it's a Delmont 88. You can practically see their eyebrows lift. The unfamiliar name makes people assume it must be some sort of rare Oldsmobile, maybe even a short-run model that collectors have forgotten about. But the truth is far less glamorous. The Delmont 88 wasn't rare, wasn't limited, and wasn't a hidden gem. It was simply the standard, full-size Oldsmobile that the company churned out relentlessly through the entire 1967 model year. In Oldsmobile's full-size lineup, the Delmont 88 occupied a very specific role. It sat below the Delta 88 and above the bare-bones base 88 models. It was the just-right middle option. More features than the economy model, but without the dressy trim, plush interiors, or prestige badges that the Delta 88 offered. In the same way Ford had the Custom, the Fairline, and the Galaxy, Oldsmobile used the Delmont name to offer buyers a comfortable, well-equipped car without moving them into the premium brackets. Because of this positioning, the Delmont 88 wasn't some boutique special. It was a volume seller. Oldsmobile marketed it to families, middle-class professionals, and anyone who wanted a solid V8-powered cruiser without paying the premium for the top-tier Delta 88. It was a sensible choice. The buy once and forget about it Oldsmobile. Reliable, roomy, and practical. And that made it extremely popular. Part of today's confusion comes from the fact that the Delmont nameplate existed only for a few years, 1965 to 1968. People often assume a short-lived model name equals rarity, but that's not how production worked in the 1960s. Automakers regularly shuffled names, trims, and submodels. A car could be sold for only a few years and still rack up massive production numbers. The Delmont 88 is a perfect example of this. Even though the name didn't survive the decade, Oldsmobile built plenty of them during those years. Another source of the rare myth is the shadow cast by the more famous Delta 88. The Delta has name recognition, collector attention, and decades of cultural presence. So when someone encounters a Delmont 88 instead, its unfamiliarity feels like exclusivity. People think, if I haven't heard of it, it must be rare. But the Delmont's lack of fame is not due to limited production, it's due to marketing. Oldsmobile put its promotional weight behind the Delta series, the 98, and the performance-oriented 442. The Delmont simply filled the gap. It was there to sell, quietly and consistently, which it did. Mechanically,
The 67 Delmont 88 was built with the same robust Oldsmobile engineering as its better-known relatives. Under the hood, most came with the Rocket V8, either the 330 or the 425, depending on the specific configuration. These engines were smooth, torquey, and durable, exactly what full-size buyers wanted at the time. Nothing about the drivetrain says limited edition or special build. These were mass-produced components, installed in mass-produced cars for the mass-produced American family lifestyle. What adds another layer of myth is its survival rate. You don't see many Delmont 88s today, not because they were rare, but because they simply weren't considered collectible. Owners used them, wore them out, traded them in, or scrapped them. Higher-end Oldsmobiles like 98s or luxury-trim Delta 88s were more likely to be babied, stored, or restored. The everyday Delmonts, they lived hard, practical lives. They were family cruisers, towing cars, vacation machines, winter beaters, and eventually disposable metal. This attrition illusion is a big problem in the classic car world. Just because you don't see a car anymore doesn't mean it was uncommon when new. The Delmont 88 suffered exactly this fate. They were everywhere in 1967, but everywhere fades fast when a car isn't cherished, pampered, or collected. Stylistically, the Delmont 88 also blends into the familiar look of late 60s Oldsmobile sedans and hardtops. Without the Delta's fancier trim or the 98's lengthened proportions, the Delmont has a clean but understated presence. It's handsome, sleek, and well-proportioned, but never showy. And that understated nature fuels yet another misconception. People assume that because it doesn't have flashy badges or excessive chrome, it must have been a niche model. In reality, it was Oldsmobile's attempt to keep costs down and broaden its appeal. Today, if someone drags a 1967 Delmont 88 out of a barn or rolls it into a car show, onlookers might think they've discovered a rare piece of history. But what they're really looking at is a survivor of a once common species. A car built for everyday Americans, produced in large numbers, and then quietly forgotten when the spotlight moved elsewhere. The Delmont 88 isn't rare. It's forgotten. And in a strange way, that makes it more interesting. It represents the vast population of full-size American cars that anchored the automotive landscape in the 1960s. Cars built not to be legendary, but to be useful.
Number 4. 1984 Chevrolet Citation II. The 1984 Chevrolet Citation II is one of the strangest cars to ever earn the accidental title of rare. Not because it was a limited production model, not because collectors fought over it, and certainly not because Chevrolet built only a few. People call it rare for one simple reason. You never see any anymore. But that has absolutely nothing to do with exclusivity. It's because the Citation II was one of General Motors' most embarrassing failures, and most of them simply died, rotted away, or were mercifully hauled to the crusher long before anyone started looking back at old cars with nostalgia. The Citation II was supposed to fix the original Citation's disastrous reputation. When the first-generation Citation arrived in 1980, it was marketed as GM's bold leap into the front-wheel drive future, a compact, modern, fuel-efficient car that would compete head-on with the imports eating Detroit's lunch. Instead, the Citation became infamous for poor build quality, weak materials, and dangerously inconsistent braking behavior. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration even launched investigations into the model because of the number of complaints. That reputation stuck like glue. By the time GM slapped the Citation II badge on the facelifted models, the company desperately hoped the name change would erase the memory of its sins. It didn't. The Citation II was still, fundamentally, the same car. Cheap front-wheel drive architecture, underpowered engines, and cost-cut engineering everywhere you looked. It was the automotive equivalent of repainting a collapsing house. And yet, Chevrolet built plenty of these things. Production numbers were not small. GM didn't think the Citation II was a niche product. They expected it to be the backbone of their compact lineup into the mid-1980s. Dealers were stocked, fleets bought them, and thousands of American families drove away in Citation IIs believing they had purchased modern, forward-thinking transportation. But survival? That's another story. The reason you rarely see a 1984 Citation II today is because they didn't survive long enough. They weren't rare, they were disposable. Most were worn out or mechanically ruined by 60,000 or 70,000 miles. Owners dealt with stalling issues, rust that appeared shockingly early, transmissions that felt like they were assembled on a Friday afternoon, and interiors that creaked, cracked, and fell apart under normal use. The suspension bushing deteriorated quickly. The steering often felt vague or unstable. Braking systems suffer from premature wear. Even the doors and glass sometimes refused to align properly after a few years. The whole car felt like it was built with components from a discount store. This is the heart of the citation rarity myth. When a car vanishes because it falls apart, not because it was unique, people misinterpret the lack of survivors as exclusivity. In reality, it's the same phenomenon you see with mid-80s Hyundais, Renault Alliances, and the Ford Fairmont. Common in their time, nearly extinct now. The Citation II just died more violently and more completely than most. Another problem comes from people's selective memory. When you think about classic GM vehicles, you picture Impalas, Camaros, CK trucks, and Corvettes. You don't picture the Citation II. It's not a car people preserve, restore, or brag about. No one says, "One day I'll restore a Citation to showroom condition." When these cars began failing, owners didn't bother fixing them. They simply bought something else. Junkyards were full of Citation II carcasses throughout the late 80s and early 1990s. Most were stripped of a few reusable parts and crushed without ceremony. Culturally, the Citation II also never gained the ironic "so bad it's good" charm that some terrible cars eventually earn. The Yugo is funny. The AMC Gremlin became a cult icon. The Ford Pinto, despite its scandals, still has recognition value. But the Citation II? It's so bland, so forgettable, so boringly mediocre that it leaves no emotional footprint. It's a car that people forgot while they were still driving it. So when someone says, "Wow, I never see a Citation anymore, must be rare," the correct answer is, no, it's not rare, it's gone. It's the difference between a limited edition collectible and a product that was simply built badly and discarded by society. The Citation II didn't fade because it was exclusive. It faded because it was hated, neglected, and engineered with shortcuts that guaranteed a short life. Its disappearance is a monument to GM's chaotic early 1980s decision-making, a reminder of the era when Detroit tried to outrun foreign competitors with rushed engineering and cut corners. Today, a surviving 1984 Citation II is not a rare gem. It's a miracle of accidental preservation. It's an artifact of how wrong a major automaker can get things. And if you ever find one still running, still intact, and still on the road, don't mistake it for rarity. Mistake it for luck. Or stubbornness.
Number 3. 1970 Ford LTD. The 1970 Ford LTD is one of those big American sedans that fools people into thinking it was some sort of premium, exclusive, limited-run luxury cruiser. Blame the chrome, blame the size, blame the elegance of late 60s Ford styling. Whatever the reason, modern drivers often assume these cars were rare specialty models. But the truth is the exact opposite. The 1970 LTD was one of the most common full-size cars in America, a dependable driveway staple that Ford built in enormous numbers. The only reason it seems rare now is because almost all of them simply vanished over time. In 1970, the LTD sat at the top of Ford's full-size lineup.
It wasn't a niche car or a limited edition luxury flagship. It was the family car of the American middle class. Ford targeted everyone: suburban families, retirees, professionals, and anyone who wanted maximum comfort without paying Lincoln prices. And it worked. Ford pumped these cars out of factories non-stop, shipping them to every corner of the country. It was the bread and butter sedan of its era, a crucial volume seller for Ford. People today forget that the luxury look was not exclusive. The LTD was designed to appear fancier than it really was, with its padded vinyl roof, wide grille, heavy chrome accents, and soft sofa-like interiors. It gave the illusion of prestige at an affordable price, so naturally, customers flocked to it. It was the perfect car for someone who wanted to feel like they owned a high-end ride without stepping up to a Lincoln Continental. This confusion only grows stronger when someone sees a surviving LTD today. Because so few remain, especially in clean condition, people misinterpret scarcity as exclusivity. But scarcity caused by attrition is not the same as actual rarity. These cars faded because they were used up, wrecked, vandalized, rusted out, or simply thrown away during the 1980s and 1990s when big sedans were suddenly unfashionable and fuel prices were rising. A large, heavy V8-powered car with single-digit city MPG was not something most people wanted to keep. As soon as these cars needed major repairs, they were scrapped. But in 1970, you couldn't drive through any suburb without spotting a dozen LTDs. They were everywhere, in grocery store parking lots, church lots, school drop-off lines, and corporate office garages. Fleet buyers loved them. Police and government branches bought the Galaxy LTD body shell for unmarked cars. Retirees loved them because they rode like marshmallows. Families loved them because you could fit your relatives, half the neighborhood kids, and 3 suitcases in the trunk. The LTD was the Swiss Army knife of big sedans. And mechanically, these cars were straightforward and built to last, at least for the first 10 to 15 years of their life. The big block and small block V8 engines were simple, rugged, and relatively easy to maintain. This reliability also contributes to the modern myth. People assume a long-lasting car must have been special. But durability is not exclusivity. A high-production, mass-market vehicle can still survive decades if treated with basic care. Another reason the LTD feels rare today is because the modern landscape has erased almost every trace of the American land yacht. Cars today are narrow, aerodynamic, and packed with electronics. Seeing a 1970 LTD, long, square, wide enough to block sunlight and plated with real chrome, feels like spotting a dinosaur wandering through a shopping mall. That shock of contrast tricks people into assuming this must have been a special order luxury car, or Ford couldn't have made many like this. But they did. Tens of thousands. Its size and bold presence are misleading. In reality, the LTD was the car you ended up with if you walked into a Ford dealer and said, "I want something comfortable." It was mainstream. It was accessible. It was absolutely not rare. If someone restored one today, it may look like a showpiece, a gleaming survivor from a bygone era of automotive excess. But in the 1970s, it was the opposite of collectible. It was disposable transportation for the middle class. No one preserved them because no one thought future generations would care. That's why the few remaining survivors feel like time capsules. The modern idea of rarity comes from absence, not exclusivity. The 1970 Ford LTD wasn't a special car. It's just a car that nobody bothered to save. In its day, it was everywhere.
Number 2. 1973 Chrysler Newport. When someone today spots a 1973 Chrysler Newport at a car show or cruising slowly through a weekend meet, you can almost guarantee one of the local old-timers will lean in and say something like, "You don't see these anymore. Must be a rare one." But the truth is almost the opposite. The 73 Newport wasn't rare, exclusive, or special. It was Chrysler's bread-and-butter full-size sedan, a car built deliberately to appeal to the most average, price-conscious American buyer of the early 1970s. You have to understand the context of Chrysler in 1973 to grasp why the Newport became so common back then. By the early 70s, Chrysler desperately needed predictable sales from its full-size lineup.
The company was dealing with financial instability, changing consumer tastes, and rising insurance costs that punished performance cars. So the Newport became the safe bet car, the one that dealerships pushed, ordered in huge numbers, and sold to anyone looking for size, comfort, and nothing more. Dealerships loved the Newport because it was basically the default configuration. If you walked into a Chrysler showroom and asked for the cheapest big car you've got, a Newport would magically appear in front of you. They were ordered in bulk, mostly in four-door sedan and hardtop form, painted in sensible colors like beige, olive green, metallic brown, or sky blue. Options? Maybe air conditioning, maybe a radio, but generally nothing flashy. Everything about it was functional simplicity. And that's exactly why so many were sold. The Newport was the no-frills gateway into Chrysler ownership. Its 400 or 440 cubic inch V8s weren't meant for burning tires. They were for smooth, quiet cruising. It was a car for families, retirees, and fleet buyers. If you wanted luxury, you bought a New Yorker. If you wanted performance, you looked to Dodge or Plymouth, at least before insurance companies killed that dream. But if you wanted something big and solid for a reasonable price, the Newport was sitting patiently on the lot waiting to be chosen. So why do people think it's rare today? Because almost none survived. These cars were enormous, heavy, and thirsty, terrible qualities once the fuel crisis hit. Many were crushed in the late 70s and 80s because they were worth more as scrap metal than as running vehicles. Others simply dissolved. Chrysler's full-size cars of this era were not known for long-term rust resistance. Winters destroyed them, neglect finished the rest. For decades, nobody saw them as collectible or meaningful. They were throwaway giants from a time when gas was cheap and chrome was still king. Survivors today are uncommon, but that does not mean the car was rare when new. It just means most were used up and discarded. That creates an illusion of scarcity. People mistake, "I haven't seen one in decades" for, "It must have been a low production special." But the Newport was everywhere in 1973. Every suburb had them lining their driveways. Every used car lot had a few sitting around with sagging suspensions and cracked vinyl tops. Police departments, taxi services, and government fleets even used them because parts were easy to get and the cars were built with simplicity in mind. And the nostalgia factor makes the illusion even stronger. Cars like the 1973 Chrysler Newport represent the final years of the truly oversized American sedan, the last era before downsizing, before emissions strangled engines, before efficiency became the priority. Today, when someone sees one, their memory rewrites the past, transforming a once common sedan into a mythical lost classic. They remember seeing hundreds, but the human mind tricks them into believing they were always rare, always special. In reality, the Newport wasn't special at all, and that's exactly what made it so successful. It was ordinary, big, comfortable, affordable, and absolutely unexciting. But now that the ordinary has disappeared, people can't help but call what's left rare. The 1973 Chrysler Newport is a perfect example of how a mass-produced car can become a nostalgic ghost in the modern world. Common in its time, but nearly forgotten today.
Number 1. 1975 Mercury Cougar XR7. When someone spots a 1975 Mercury Cougar XR7 today, sitting at a car show, parked at a gas station, or rumbling through town, the reaction is often the same. Wow, that must be a rare luxury coupe. The long hood, opera windows, vinyl roof, padded interior, and Baroque chrome details make it look like some kind of limited edition personal luxury trophy. But here's the twist. The 1975 Cougar XR7 was anything but rare. Mercury built these things in huge quantities. It wasn't meant to be exclusive. It wasn't meant to stand apart. It was designed to swim in the same overcrowded pond as the Buick Riviera, Oldsmobile Tornado, Chevrolet Monte Carlo, Pontiac Grand Prix, and Ford's own Thunderbird. And it did exactly that, compete with them in sheer volume.
To understand the Cougar XR7 of 1975, you need to forget the image of the late 1960s Cougar, the sporty, agile pony car that carved its identity as a more refined Mustang. By the mid-1970s, the Cougar had completely abandoned its performance roots. Mercury reinvented it as a full-on personal luxury car, a padded land barge with more emphasis on plushness than power. This had nothing to do with sportiness and everything to do with marketing trends. The American auto industry in the mid-1970s was obsessed with personal luxury. Gas prices were high, emissions rules were tightening, insurance skyrocketed, and muscle cars were basically being strangled out of existence. Instead of horsepower, car companies sold style. Opera windows, velour seats, fake wood, thick carpets, and chrome accents everywhere. Buyers wanted comfort, status, and presence without paying Cadillac prices. So, Mercury obliged. The Cougar XR7 became a tool for this new direction. It was built on the Torino LTD2 platform, big, soft, heavy, and incredibly average underneath. There was nothing exotic about its engineering. No special chassis, no handmade touches, no limited run craftsmanship. Everything was mass-produced at scale. The XR7 package itself was basically a styling upgrade. Nicer materials, a fancier dash, extra chrome, and that signature padded roof with the tiny oval opera windows that screamed 1970s luxury. Dealerships ordered them by the truckload. If you walked into a Mercury showroom in 1975 and said, "I want something classy," the salesman would pull you right toward the XR7. It was the car Mercury used to lure middle-class buyers who wanted Riviera looks at Ford prices. Because of that, thousands rolled out of showrooms across America. They weren't special, they were simply the default choice for a mid-size luxury coupe. So why do people assume they're rare today? Survivorship illusion. Like many cars from the 1970s, most Cougar XR7s didn't survive the decades. These cars were notorious for rust, especially around the vinyl roof, rear quarters, and floor pans, fragile emission-strangled V8s that produce low power, weak automatic transmissions stressed by heavy bodies, thin chrome that pitted easily, shoddy materials that aged prematurely. By the time the 1990s rolled around, these cars were practically worthless on the used market. They were sold cheap, abused, neglected, or junked. Many ended up in demolition derbies because they were big, easy to find, and had no collectible value. Fast forward to today, a surviving 1975 Cougar XR7 is actually an unusual sight. Not because production numbers were low, but because so many were destroyed, crushed, or forgotten. The few that remain, especially clean ones, feel like survivors of a lost era. And that creates the perfect illusion. People mistake, "I haven't seen one in 20 years," for "this must have been a limited, luxurious, rare model." But back in 1975, it wasn't rare at all. It was one of the most common personal luxury coupes on the road. What really makes the XR7 interesting today is not its rarity, but its story. It represents the exact moment Mercury shifted from sporty to plush, from performance to appearance, from Mustang cousin to Thunderbird rival. It symbolizes the automotive industry's transition away from horsepower towards luxury themes and styling gimmicks. The 1975 Cougar XR7 wasn't a high-end luxury car. It was a mass-market imitation of one, a factory-built fantasy of prestige designed for the middle class. And while people today might think it was some exclusive coupe for the elite, the reality is far simpler. It was built in huge batches, sold everywhere, and meant for everyone. The rare luxury coupe image is just nostalgia repainting the past.